This week on Quadriga, rise of terror, civil liberties in danger? After terror attacks in Paris, Brussels, and now Copenhagen, public events in Europe have been cancelled. And Jewish groups are increasingly worried about becoming victims. Can fundamental rights only be exercised today under police protection? Fear is on the rise as horrendous attacks, like the beheading of 21 Coptic Christians in Libya, occur with alarming regularity. Is the peaceful coexistence of different cultures and faiths under threat? Your host this week, Peter Craven.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Quadriga, coming to you from Berlin. And after the double terror attack in Copenhagen, there have been calls in Denmark for tougher security measures. So the question really is how to get the right balance between security on the one hand, freedom on the other. And the big question is, are our civil liberties in danger? That's what we're going to be discussing today. It's a tough issue. I've got three very interesting panellists, three very familiar faces here on Quadriga to discuss these difficult questions with us. Let me introduce them to you, beginning with the Anglo-German writer and journalist Alan Posener, who is also a correspondent for the Berlin-based daily Die Welt. Also here today is the freelance journalist Antje Bauer, whose specialist fields include the Middle East, Turkey and Afghanistan. She is also, it's worth mentioning, somebody who teaches courses in journalism in various Arab countries for Deutsche Welle's own academy. And another familiar face is Judy Dempsey, currently a writer and analyst for the Carnegie Foundation. Judy has worked for a long list of international broadcasters in a long and illustrious career. Welcome to all three of you. And Judy, I'd like to begin with you with the big question, the central question in today's debate. Are our civil liberties in danger?
Well, civil liberties are in danger when synagogues are attacked, when restaurants are attacked, when newspapers are attacked, when people are attacked in the streets and on the underground. Yes, in that sense, our civil liberties, those kind of civil liberties are absolutely in danger. And the question is, people living in these societies that are attacked, they do expect the state, their government, their elected representatives to protect them. The big question is the extent of that protection that will protect them on the one hand, but actually protect the democratic values which the West certainly cherishes. It's an enormously complicated issue, and the balance is very difficult to achieve.
Yeah, it's all about getting the right balance. After the attacks in Copenhagen, the Danish Prime Minister, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, she vowed that her country would emerge, and I'm quoting, more united and stronger. But there have been these calls for tighter and tougher security measures. It's perfectly understandable, is it not?
It is understandable, and anybody living in Europe would want this. And in fact, those living outside Europe are desperately in need of protection, given what ISIS is doing and the havoc it's wreaking all over the Middle East. The more I think about this unbelievably difficult issue, the more I think we have to defend our civil liberties and everything we stand for. The press freedom, the right to speak out, the right to protect these liberties. If we don't, we are actually giving in.
Alan, you are nodding.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to differentiate between different liberties that you have. I don't think there's an absolute liberty, for instance, to go into a supermarket without being, for instance, frisked. If you live in Israel or you visit Israel, you go into a nightclub, you go into a cinema, you go into a supermarket, they check your car, they check that you're not having anything with you. And I'm fine with that, because that means I'm not sort of looking at my neighbour, has he got something in his bag or in her bag? You know, sort of
security.
That's more security. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what's really important is to be able to say what I want. And this is where, you know, we're beginning to have what Germans call the scissors in your head, the censored scissors in your head. Oh, do I have to say this? Because it might offend someone, and not only offend that person, which after all I have a right to do, but that person might take such offence that he or she, mostly he unfortunately, is going to kill me. And then you start saying, oh, is it worth my life to criticise, shall we say, certain tenets of Islam, or to, you know, or so on, or to, and this has been going on for a long time. This started with Salman Rushdie, when a fatwa went out from Iran, let's not forget that, from Ayatollah Khomeini, saying, kill this man, and kill anyone who aids him. And there were attacks on his Danish interpreter and on publishers and so on. That was when it started. That was when one started to think, when they didn't sell the book over the counter, but under the counter and so on. And this has been going on, and unfortunately I feel that the radical Islamists are gaining ground in our heads. We're beginning to think what we say before we say it.
When you talk about Salman Rushdie and what happened back then, that was then, now is now, and you say we are beginning to have scissors in our heads. Are you talking about yourself as a journalist?
I'm talking about myself as a journalist. I'm even talking about myself as a private person. Back then, we thought of having a fancy dress party with the theme of the satanic verses. And someone said to me, you know, is that really very wise? You know, you never know who might turn up at your big party and cause a ruckus. And we changed the theme. I mean, that's a small thing. But also, you know, within the paper, do you reprint the Charlie Hebdo caricatures so people know what they're talking about, or are you endangering yourself and your fellow journalists? There's all sorts of things that you start to think of that you actually shouldn't think of. I would like to think, you know, do I want to insult Muslims? Because I don't. Do I want to show respect for the Muslim faith? Because I do, yes. But I don't want to do that under duress, sort of...
Under threat of death.
Under threat, yes.
Antje, what do you say? Are our basic fundamental freedoms in danger? It doesn't... I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, but when you're walking, the sun is shining outside in Berlin now, you're walking along the street, you don't necessarily feel that your freedoms, your fundamental freedoms, are being threatened.
Yeah, I feel this threat as well. I agree to the colleagues. I wonder if the ways to defend our civil liberties would not be a way also to kill our civil liberties. That's what you said. The question is also always how far you go in trying to secure everybody, and if that doesn't mean that in the end you will not be able to do what you need to do, or speaking out. I have a problem, for example, not only talking in public, but talking with, for example, Muslim friends, to talk openly. Because there's a question, I think, there's a debate we have to lead with the Muslim world somehow, to be able to speak out without being under the suspicion to be anti-Muslim, you know? When I try to talk with Muslims about the problem of radical Islam, they say, this is not Islam. And mostly I stay quiet because I think things will heat up and there will be fissure, there will be a separation between them and me, which is not necessary there to be. But I think it is Islam, and we have to debate about it. It is one interpretation of Islam. So I think one is the public thing, which is more and more difficult to do, and the other thing is our debate within let's say, friends or within friendly atmosphere.
So when we talk abstractly as we are about the threat to our freedoms, are we talking about a threat to our freedoms from terrorism, or are we talking about specifically a threat from Islamic terror? Or are we talking about, what are we talking about exactly? Where does this threat come from?
I think we're talking about terrorism. Of course, it may be under the guise of Islamic terrorism. And ISIS has certainly given a terrible reputation to the Islamic world and to the moderate Muslim world, which it would be really, really great if more Muslims in the Arab world spoke up instead of Western secular, Western Christendom saying, oh, Islam must speak up. This gets into a patronizing game or a blame game. This is the first issue. But the threat is coming from terrorism. These ISIS terrorists. And they don't speak in the name of religion. If they did, they wouldn't be beheading Christians, people, children, kidnapping them, putting them into sex slaves. It is truly appalling, this evil. This terrorism is reaching the shores of Europe. Whether or not the Danish case was a kind of copycat case is very hard to know. The person was apparently just released from prison 2 or 3 weeks earlier. But yesterday, that was Wednesday, I was reading the papers and reports coming out of the Middle East, now that ISIS is in Libya, which is on the shores of the Mediterranean. For the first time, they said they wanted this was going to be their bridgehead to get into Europe and show the Europeans, you know, destroy their values. I actually do feel threatened.
You feel threatened?
Yes, I do. And it's very hard to describe it. And it's out there, and I've been in terrorist attacks before as a journalist, And way back when I was indeed in university in Dublin, when the IRA struck our university.
Very important point. Yeah.
And in London, I was part of these attacks. I mean, it nearly hit. In the Middle East, where I was based, I don't know how many times one feared being killed. But this is different.
You're saying you feel very
but
threatened
this is different.
now.
Yes, I feel threatened now because our way of life is being threatened. It's a specific way of life, and the debate has yet to start on how we're going to protect our values of protecting women, of liberalism, of freedom of speech, in not being politically correct, in being able to reach out and not have the debate polarised or hijacked.
What role do or should our governments, should the German government play in all this? Is the role of the German government protecting in the first instance or guaranteeing our safety or guaranteeing our freedoms? How does that work?
Well, you can't really divide the two because, you know, if you're dead, you don't have any freedom, right? So the right, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it says in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. So first, life. Then when you're alive, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So that's what the government has to defend. First and foremost, the life of its citizens. And that's an almost impossible task at the same time. That's the problem. Because with the attacks in France against Charlie Hebdo, and I think also in Copenhagen and elsewhere, you have not only the ISIS connection, you have this homegrown self-radicalization via the internet. You know, it might be your neighbor's son. You know, it's not just the dregs of society. It's educated people who somehow get alienated, and we who have been young know that can happen. I mean, and fall into the wrong hands, or fall into the wrong hands on the internet. This self-radicalization, and then go out, take a car and drive into a group of people at the bus and kill. That's happened in Jerusalem. It's also happened in France. Yeah. So we're living. If you're living in the south of France, you know, the sun may be shining, but you're in the same kind of danger as in Jerusalem. And the problem is we've got to live with that, because there's no way outside of a fascist dictatorship you could prevent that kind of thing happening. So you've got to live with danger. At the same time, however, you've got to hope that people will, you know, that the security agencies will be onto these people sooner rather than later.
What are the right measures for the government to take at this point in time, either in Denmark or in France or in Germany, in fact, across the EU? What measures could they adopt to tighten security that would have an impact without infringing on our freedoms?
In some ways, it's a very simple one. People should be more aware. Just take care. Take care at airports, at public places, going to the cinemas, supermarkets. It's not always looking over your shoulder, but just taking more care and being careful of your neighbours, making sure they're okay as well. I mean, this kind of demands a response from the civil society as well. Civil society is about our values. And civil society needs here protection as well. And civil society must be propelled into saying, yes, this is worth defending. It doesn't mean you have to have army patrols all over the place, but it's a public awareness that if we have to protect our values, the citizen too must take responsibility instead of just leaning always on the state and the apparatus of the security services.
Wise words. What do you say, Antje?
Yeah, I think the civil society is the most important point in this. One is the security agencies, obviously, they have to do their work. But I think on the other hand, and you ask for the reaction of German government, for example, when what happened in with Charlie Hebdo, for example, I liked very much the gesture they had, that they convened at the Brandenburg door, and together with Islamic, Turkish, Arabic, Jewish,
at the
Catholic,
Brandenburg Gate, just round the corner from here, they gathered together. Yeah. And what was the message?
The message was, we stand together. That was including the Muslims. And this was a gesture which I liked very much. I was present there. I was a little bit deceived that there were only some thousand people. I think there should have been some millions.
It was quite a small turnout.
Yes.
It was a moving ceremony, but it was a small turnout.
Yeah, because there had been turnouts before, the days before. But I think that was the right gesture, to say we stand together. We don't separate now between those who are Muslims and those who are not. And we try to integrate, because I think there are reasons also. We are not guilty of everything which is happening there. But we have our part, our share in this. I think one reason why so many people have left Europe, for example, and gone to fight with ISIS is the feeling of discrimination. I think the integration policy here in Europe has failed mostly. More failed in France, and I think we see this in all these banlieues, which is going up in flames all the time. I think here it's a bit better, but still it failed. And I think there's something...
How, in concrete terms, has it failed in Germany?
Because for the longest time, the governments and the political parties, most of them, have denied that Germany is a country of immigration, and they thought all these people would return, and they didn't help them to integrate. And so things have gone much better in the last years, but I think there's a lot of things to do. It is enough to go in Berlin to go to Neukölln, which is a place where Arabs and Turks live, and to see the difference between this place and other places where you have mainly Germans. There's an awful difference. And you have to level these things. The HLM in France are worse even, and you see them, they are...
Explain what an HLM is.
HLM is one of these social buildings built by government with low rents, and where the people live who have no money, and where you have all these youth who create groups, and from where the revolts start, and where you have a lot of young Islamists. And I think there's a social policy which has to be implemented and strengthened as well.
Well, of course, how could one disagree? I mean, you're right, both of you, but let's face it, no society can ever be the total peaceful thing that we would like, that maybe social democracy thinks about. There's always going to be discontents. Yes. There's always going to be people who are left behind. There's always going to be, you know, you could say that an immigrant in France, someone in the banlieue, is living 100 times better than someone in North Africa. But that's not the point. The point is he sees that someone in the rich arrondissement lives 100 times better than he does or she does. So there's going to be this, and it's mostly he. So there's also this case of young men with too much testosterone and I don't know what else. So that's always going to be there. There's always going to be a danger, and that's why you do need security forces. And I think one of the bad things that's happened here is that we've been concentrating too much on criticizing people, what the NSA, for instance, the Americans have been doing, what the British have been doing. You know, all this talk about Big Brother watching our every move, controlling Facebook and so on. I only wish they controlled Facebook well enough to discover these people who said on Facebook what they were going to do. And the whole point is that so-called social media, which are often anti-social media, are still not policed in the same way that our streets are policed. So we need to not to focus on the United States NSA as being Big Brother. We need to say this has to be done. I don't like it.
Are you suggesting that now that we have seen so many attacks, not just Brussels, not just Copenhagen, not just Paris, but before that London and Madrid and others, we have seen so many attacks now, a whole chain, a whole series of attacks, that we are now effectively in a war on terror situation in Europe? Because that's what you seem to be suggesting, that we should be adopting similar kinds of policies, the NSA complex, Homeland Security and the Patriot Act and so on and so forth, which many Germans have scoffed at.
Well, you know, there's lots of things to criticize on the Patriot Act and so on, and the whole concept of a war on terror, because a war is waged by the military. I think our police and intelligence forces are quite able, given the right number of people, given the right laws and given the right technical possibilities, none of which we have in Europe, to do this not as a war but as policing the internet and policing those places where terrorists are recruited, which unfortunately we know what they are. In Berlin there are 2 mosques. We know these 2 mosques and so on. I presume they are also being policed, but they need to be policed, of course, by people who understand Arabic or Turkish or whatever they're, you know, and that kind of thing. They also need to. So you need to do what the police does, not what the army does, but you need to do it, and it's not being done.
She sighs.
No, look, there's no easy fixes to this, and there's no. Any leader will tell you, any security chief will tell you, any Chancellor Merkel herself would say, there's no such thing as 100% security. We know this, but policing the social media. Well, you don't need a big brother. You're going to have a huge apparatus of eavesdroppers. I mean, this is not sustainable, and it's actually not welcome either in some ways, at all. Actually, this huge network of spying. Maybe this sounds naive, but it really has to start in education, opening up the schools as what Antje mentioned, and a much more aggressive integration. But it's all very well having an integration program, and indeed the German government now has really stepped up this, but you've got to underpin it with economic perspectives, a prospect, with a kind of stake in the society. And as Adam said, I mean, there's always those who fall off the ladder or just on the bottom. This is different. This is not even about the ladder. This is something off the radar screens. This is something invisible. This is something out there which is very difficult to detect and rein in. But this is why the public awareness has to be really tackled.
There's something I don't have a solution for, but which I see as a very big problem. I think in the last century, the grounds have been laid for big prejudices in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, against the West. There's an anti-Western discourse, narrative, which is very, very good for the governments, actually, because it's very easy always to find the enemy, the guilty one on the other side for every problem. But it works with the people as well. And it's frightening. And I feel like what is going on with ISIS, and the reason that so many people are getting radicalized in the Muslim world, has something to do with this. Like a feeling we have been suppressed, we have been discriminated against, which is all true, but it's not enough because it's being used not to debate about what's going on. For example, one thing that what I miss is a clear pronunciation of Muslim clerics all over the Muslim world to say this is not the type of Islam we defend. There are some who say, but they are not clear enough. They are not talking clearly. For example, the most important cleric at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, he is not saying we strictly condemn this way of doing this. So I think there has to be a debate between the non-Muslim world and the Muslim world also, to try to get over this old discrimination narrative, to try to find a common ground of debate.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just quickly come in here? I actually agree with you on this. This is very depressing, and having lived in the Middle East, what I found most depressing was the appalling anti-Semitism in Egypt. It was quite disgusting, and I remember reporting at the time when I visited Cairo and then I came back to Jerusalem. It was absolutely vile, and this anti-Semitism is somehow linked with the West. Rather, this hatred of the Jews, the West is, because the West supports Israel, we are therefore supporting the Jews. The whole thing has become so manipulated, even today, by several Arab countries. And the tragedy is that, which is very, very sad, that the Jewish communities in Europe do actually now feel threatened. It's shocking after the Second World War that this is happening.
Let me pick up on that. Jewish communities in Europe, there's no doubt about it, are increasingly living in fear. There's been a lot of focus in the last couple of weeks, for obvious reasons, after the attacks in Paris, on the French community on the Jewish community in France. Let's have a look now at the Jewish community here in Germany and see what's happening there.
2.5 years ago, Rabbi Daniel Alter was attacked and beaten in a Berlin street. He's grown careful about where he goes in the city.
There are anti-Semitic hotspots in Berlin where I wouldn't recommend Jews to identify themselves as Jews in public. They can expect verbal attacks at the very least.
German police recorded 200 anti-Semitic acts in 2013, fairly steady compared with previous years. Young Israelis are still moving to hit Berlin, but after the attacks in Paris and Copenhagen, they feel insecure.
das führt auch so weit, dass jetzt wir das bei den
It's worth making the point that when parents apply to kindergartens and Jewish schools for their children, they want to know all about security in the schools. It's quite macabre.
Fast schon makaber.
Nevertheless, German Jewish communities have not faced the level of hostility that is now commonplace in France, where many Jews have already chosen to emigrate to Israel.
It's very disturbing. Schools here in Berlin, around Germany, parents selecting the schools because they've got good security. Yeah?
Yeah, well, they select the schools because they're Jewish schools, but they also ask about the security.
Yeah.
Any synagogue you go to, there's police in front of it, there's security cameras. It's like a, it's like a fortress, and this shouldn't have to be the case.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Because the real problem is we've been talking very abstractly about the threat to liberties in Germany, in Europe. The people who are experiencing the threat concretely are the Jewish communities. It's a completely different picture. Yeah?
But not only. We don't have to forget that after what happened with Charlie Hebdo, a lot of Muslim shops and mosques have been attacked in France as well. So there's a polarization, but there's a rise of the threat for everybody.
It's
So
interesting.
the terrorists have succeeded. They've created division, they've created hatred between communities.
Well, there's an element of this, the attacks on the Muslims, especially after Charlie Hebdo, and it happened in the United States last week. These are revenge attacks. It's really horrible, and but leaving that aside, the fact that synagogues have to be protected, even before, for years and years they've had to be protected. It's quite, it's not puzzling, this residual anti-Semitism. It's frightening that people who want to pray, that their houses of worship have to be protected, and that the schools have to be protected. In Europe, which lost so many of its Jewish communities during the Holocaust. This is very disturbing, and the revenge aspect is equally disturbing. It hasn't come to the stage of the polarization because the Jewish communities have, in Berlin, Germany particularly, have spoken out for the need to end this Islamophobia, which is very present. Remember the Pegida movement. Yeah. So, I mean, they are trying to reach out because they know if they don't, I mean, it'll actually get worse.
This is an important point to make. The Jewish communities everywhere, I think, have always said that they solidarize work together with other minorities, immigrant communities, and so on, because they realize that the civil liberties for minorities are indivisible. And so you notice this when there was a big debate about circumcision in Germany about 2 years ago, when actually the Muslims let the Jews do the argument in favor of allowing circumcision, when there was a big movement among bio-Germans to sort of forbid circumcision. Infant circumcision. So the Muslims were very happy to let the Jews do the argument here, and they work together on that. Yes. But they're also working together when it's the case of slaughter of animals and so on, according to halal or kosher rules and regulations. So it's all the more tragic that a certain section of the Muslim community should now attack the very people they should be working with, together with against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all other kinds of racism. It's tragic. It's terrible.
And when you say a certain section of the Muslim community, what do you mean specifically? I mean, it's interesting. I'd just like to bring in the thought that we've seen in the last couple of days or so an Israeli journalist wore a kippah in Paris and walked around the town for 10 hours going to all sorts of different areas. And he was mistreated by all sorts of different people. Basically, we're talking about sort of young Muslim men, in essence, really.
We're talking about young Muslim men, yes, but on the basis of what Judy was saying about this sort of virulent anti-Semitism, which is present and which is transmitted via satellite dish, for instance, into the homes of Muslims all over Europe. My wife was a teacher until recently in a Muslim part of Berlin, and when she was introducing a new class and people sort of stood up and said what I like and what I hate, I like pizza, I hate, I don't know, going to school or doing homework. One person from Lebanon, a 6-year-old boy, says, I love pizza, I hate Jews. So, you know, this wasn't his own experience. This is what he got from his parents. And this has to be discussed. You know, he doesn't know any Jews. What he means is, my parents are refugees from Lebanon and they have issues with with Israel. But, you know, the way they talk about it, it's the Jews.
Yeah. But what is very important is that we don't bring in the issue of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an excuse for this anti-Semitism, which is what's being used. The two must be absolutely kept separate, because anti-Semitism is actually is anti the Jews. And to equate this with the state of Israel and what's happening with Palestine, it's not legitimate, and it is actually morally and politically wrong, and it's intellectually dishonest. So this young Israeli who went around for I saw this clip that went around for 10 hours walking the streets of Paris. It was horrible, just because it's about being different.
It was quite interesting, though, I have to say. Yes. Just to add one point. I don't know if you saw in one of the main German newspapers, the Süddeutsche Zeitung from Munich. They had a report from a man. I don't have his name, but he did the same thing over many days, I believe. Can you tell us about the results, as it were, of his little experiment?
Well, he went around in the kippah in Munich for, I don't know, a whole week, or he always does it, in fact. Yeah, and he said he's never experienced anything. You know, I mean, he goes to his Bosnian, i.e. Muslim, falafel seller, and he's perfectly friendly with him and so on. So one would hope that in Munich it's better than in Paris.
Are we talking about young Muslim men, or are we talking about young Muslim men and young criminals, or there's a sort of a crossover thing going on here? Yeah, how much of a problem is that? Is that a problem in Germany? Because before I ask you to talk about that, let's just have a look at another report about the situation in France in French prisons.
Two of the Paris attackers were apparently radicalized in prison, a pattern seen in many European countries. Inside the walls, say former prisoners, joining Muslim groups is sometimes the only way to survive.
I felt looked after, even loved. I felt I had brothers around me, that I was protected and safe.
But that sense of belonging and safety comes at a price.
One of the other prisoners said, "You're now a real Muslim and your mission will be to defend Islam by killing the unbelievers across the world. When you leave prison, get in touch with this person so you can train to do jihad."
He did not, but imams say that they feel like they're fighting a losing battle.
There are only 180 Muslim counselors for around 40,000 Muslim prisoners. The Prime Minister has announced that another 60 will be taken on, but that's still not enough.
An important step on the road to convincing Muslim prisoners that terrorism has nothing to do with Islam.
What do you say about those impressions, Antje? Do we have the same kind of problems here in Germany?
Somehow, yes. It's a question of social underdogs, partly. For example, there's a famous rapper here whose name is Dennis Kuspert, and he was quite famous before. He was in prison several times because of small criminality, and then he got radicalized, and then he went to Syria to work with ISIS. But I think it's not only this. We have this problem here in Europe. Very often it's a question of social underdogs. But I think it's not enough to think like ISIS is being composed only of small criminals, because that would be underestimate the people they have. And if we see how well they are organized and how well they do with all this, only looking at the media work they are doing, which is great. So I think we have to recognize they're highly qualified people. And I have seen, for example, in the Middle East since many years, that there's something like what I said before, against the Occident, against the West. And those people are getting radicalized. They feel, I wondered very often, what is it? Engineers, medical doctors, people like this, who are completely against the West and who go back to like a sort of Muslim identity, which is not new. That is, they are getting radicalized since years. For example, all these people who are behind the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they are also, many of them are middle class, qualified people. And I think the question is there that they feel they do not get what they deserve in their own system, and they find an enemy again. I think there's a problem of this is a projection screen somehow.
It's really interesting hearing this. I wonder, is it when you say it's against the West? This is such an old struggle. It goes back a long, long time. Is it also the full stop put to modernization of the Arab world, leaving aside the colonialism and the Turkish Empire and so many other issues? I wonder, is it something got to do with failed modernity, or that modernity actually didn't happen, and that there's now a complete mismatch between the West, how the West has developed industrially, technologically, in all sorts of ways, and this, it is a backward. It's a backwardness. It's a stopping of the development of societies. This must be immensely frustrating for middle classes who've been educated abroad, many of these people, and they've come home and they see that modernity has stopped. And this is something that the West can't influence. It is something that perhaps has to come from within, and this is going to be such a very long process. And indeed, we have seen what Turkey is now undergoing, a kind of anti-modernity.
Yeah, but Turkey is a good example for, I agree to you, but I think that's part of the truth, because Turkey has been developing a lot.
Absolutely.
And if you see Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, they are rich. And still they have these people who are Saudi Arabia is providing lots and lots of fighters for IS.
Absolutely. But just because you're rich doesn't mean you embrace modernity. Doesn't mean that you embrace values, doesn't mean that you embrace a civil society of accountability, of a division between the state and society.
Yeah, the question is how you define modernity.
Indeed. I mean, I'm trying to define it there. So there's this complete gap between the richness of a state like Qatar or Saudi Arabia and the paucity of political debate and political structures.
I thought it was interesting what that young man was saying in the clip we saw, that in the prison they told him, now you are a true Muslim, so you must go out and serve your faith by killing unbelievers all over the world. You know, I can understand someone in prison finding values, finding the simplicity of truth, finding inner peace and a mission to life by finding religion. But then, sort of, what do you do when you find religion? You go out and kill the enemies of Islam, basically everyone who isn't a Muslim. And this, I think, is the real problem. One of the things that I don't think has developed in the Arab world especially, and in the Muslim world more generally, is this Western habit of self-criticism. If something goes wrong, we usually blame ourselves for it. All too often, I think, sometimes we aren't to blame, but we have this habit of introspection and how can we do it better, and we, you know, a government makes mistakes, we elect a new government and so on. There's this constant process of how can we do things better, and the impression I get whenever I visit in the Arab world especially is there's this thing of how the others have mistreated us, how there's been this conspiracy of America and so on, and possibly also members of their own upper class, and this, that, and the other, and the Jews, of course, always the Jews. There's no introspection of what can we do? Where is the mistake within ourselves which we have to overcome to become a power?
I'd like to pick up on the word introspection. It fascinates me. One of the titles I'd written down here in my notes, and I'm not even sure why, is Terrorism Has a History. And I think it's very important that here in Europe, I mean, you're an expert, Antje, on all things Spanish. There's a terrorist movement in Spain still with ETA, Ireland, a history of terrorism. Germany had the Baader-Meinhof terrorism chapter.
And NSU.
And the NSU, yeah.
France had the...
What can we learn? What have we learned from these histories of terrorism through the process of introspection?
It's very interesting that you bring up the IRA, that's the Irish Republican Army, that did wage a very bitter and violent campaign in Northern Ireland to either reunite it with Ireland as if the Republic was willing to take on the IRA as the new leaders of Ireland. What we learned, which was it was a very, very long, painful process. You had to talk. You just have to understand why are they doing this. It took many, many years, but it needed the Dublin government and the British government to actually say, hang on, we have to do this with the dialogue. And bit by bit, thankfully, the Americans played an enormously important role on this, phenomenal. But it's a bit like the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there was a complete unity of purpose by the Americans, by the Germans, and by the Russians. We won't mention the Brits and the French. But this is a historic chance, you grasp it. And I think the British and the Irish governments, with the Americans, George Mitchell, they realised, this is the time. We can't let this continue.
You have to sit down and talk.
But the political will...
You have to recognise positions.
Yes,
there cannot just be an us and them.
Yeah, I think it's the point of marginalisation. They have been marginal, or they have felt marginalised. With ETA is the same. I think for these people who go and fight with ISIS, it's also a question of feeling discriminated against or marginalised. I think what you said about these guys in prison, I think it's a question of belonging. They feel once they don't feel put apart, but they belong to something. And so I think what we have to do is, I agree to you, is really to try to find a common ground to discuss, and not to allow that you have these frontiers where you just allow the fight to move.
Almost the last word of the programme, Alan.
Well, I think one thing we also have to learn is that how quickly you can descend into terrorism yourself. I mean, Europe knows that better than anyone. Let's not forget that just a couple of years ago, 8,000 Muslim men were killed in Srebrenica by Christian Serbs. Let's not forget that Germany has a terrorist past. So we know what we're dealing with. We know how easily neighbours can become killers.
Yes.
One sentence.
The Danish penal system is actually looking into this very issue of recruitment inside the prisons. Hats off to them.
So where to go? We've been discussing getting the balance right between security and freedom in the battle against terror. I wrote down one quote from Benjamin Franklin: "Those who sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither." I hope we've given you plenty of food for thought. Bye-bye from this latest edition of Quadriga from Berlin.